Michael Ignatius opens it, then Diana follows, and then gives the urgency issue, and then you proceed. It's like, it's just even.
Hi. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Okay.
Hi, I'm Michael. Good to see you in person.
Good to see you.
Yeah, great to meet in person. Thank you for coming here, doing the launch and everything. It's fantastic. Yes, no, right? But it happened. It took some time, but this is really great.
Yes.
And I hear you trying to speak with Michael yesterday as well. Hello, I'm Michael Lavelle. We once had a little... Okay, great. Oh, really?
It's out of order. I need to know what's
Yes.
Az esemény legfontosabb szereplőjét várjuk. So we are waiting for the main actor of this event. So now we are able to start, and I would like to welcome everyone. My name is Ada Amon, and I'm the chair of the board of the Energia Club, which is a Hungarian think tank working on energy issues and climate policy. Let me introduce first of all the speakers of this event. The launch of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report of 2019. The first speaker and who will open the whole event is Michael Ignatieff, the President Rector of Central European University. I don't think that I have to introduce him. The second speaker of this event will be Diana Uge-Forsatz, who is a professor of the CEU, but at the same time he chairs one of the chapters of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and she's going to address that issue because the report of this year is focusing very much on the relationship of nuclear and climate change and climate policy. Thirdly, Benedek Javor, who is a former member of the European Parliament and has been working on the disclosure of the nuclear power plant, new nuclear power plant, and the information rights of the Hungarian people to that issue, will also address at the end of the event this issue. And Michael Schneider, who is the leader and the lead author and editor and coordinator of the World Nuclear Industry Status Report project, will present us the main findings of the report of this year. So I will now ask Mr. Ignatieff to open the event.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to CEU. We extend a particularly warm welcome to anybody who's never been through the door before. Here we are, here's what we look like. This is a classroom, and we hope you'll come through our door anytime you want to. I'm delighted to introduce this event for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that universities are not political organizations, despite what you've heard in certain of the media. Our job is to provide argument, reason, evidence, and research to sustain public policy debate. We try to be a fact-based organization in a world of rumor, paranoia, and organized lies. We don't always achieve the status of perfect adherence to what is essentially a morality of intellectual life, but it's very important to all universities, and particularly to this one. And there are few areas where we need facts and evidence more than in the area of nuclear power on the one hand and climate change on the other, and the relationship between the two. We are proud that we have made our contribution as a university to this area. We have some very fine, internationally recognized specialists in this field. A couple of them are in the House. Diana Urge-Borsats has an international reputation as a leading thinker and advocate in the field of climate change. Michael Lebel, who you'll hear from, is another who's a Jean Monnet chair in this field in our department. That's Jean Monnet means it's pretty fancy, pretty important, so treat him with the respect that he's due. And we have a department, the Department of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, chaired by a distinguished Hungarian, Lassi Pinter, who also has done an enormous amount of work in the field of climate change. So we feel we've been thinking about this for a long time and making our small contribution, and so it makes sense for us to welcome the World Nuclear Industry Status Report for 2019 and thank Michael Schneider for an extraordinary piece of evidence-based assessment of a hugely important industry. He gave me a advanced briefing on the contents of this report, and I will not Bigfoot him, as we say in English, by disclosing what he told me, but I can tell you you're about to hear some rather surprising conclusions, or at least they were surprising to this old Neanderthal here, and I do want to commend him for this work, because I don't think we can have any discussion of the future of nuclear no discussion at all about the relationship between the contribution that nuclear can or cannot make to energy sustainability and zero carbon by whatever date you choose, unless we know what the facts of this industry as it currently stands are. I hardly need add that this is not a kind of abstract discussion in Hungary. The Pax issue, which doubtless will come up, makes this issue and the role of nuclear power in Hungary's energy mix a very urgent and burning political issue, and it has been so for a large number of years. And as everyone knows, it hardly needs said, this is both an energy issue and a geostrategic issue about the national independence of Hungary, its dependence on other foreign powers, etc., etc. I hardly need spell that out, and the university, needless to say, doesn't take a position, but it's extremely important, I think, that we have a fair-minded, evidence-based discussion of nuclear power in the nuclear industry, and I'm delighted to start this off. I will have to zip out in a little while, but that is not from lack of interest, but simply from the demands of doing the job I do. But I welcome everybody here. I also hope that those of you who can stay on for the academic gathering this afternoon, which Michael may tell you more about, we're going to basically make a day of this here at CU, and we invite everybody in the room to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now it's Diana's turn. Yes.
But it's not there. Oh, okay. So you can only see it here.
Is it gonna go on this?
It says,
It's a different setting.
no, I think it will just go on here. That's fine.
But maybe it can be on both sides.
Yeah,
Would
I
be
don't know why
easier.
it's not going both sides.
Yeah, we're gonna arrange it in a minute. So
Yeah, I'll
Yes.
just get started
There we
and
go.
oh, perfect. Perfect. Okay, so good morning everybody, and first of all, thank you for the privilege of having been able to write the foreword to this very pertinent report, and I would like to give you a couple of words why I believe that this report this year is especially important. And fortunately, I don't think I need to persuade you about the importance of climate change in this location and this particular audience, but I do want to share with you my almost a little bit desperation. I just returned yesterday for this launch from the latest plenary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where we are approving the new special report on oceans and climate change. Unfortunately, I can't share any of its findings because it's not going to be public until tomorrow. But unfortunately, you will see that there are already in it a couple of even newer news on how we have already destroyed permanently or irreversibly some crucial ecosystems, even in Europe, and this is already beyond the point of no return, unfortunately. So, but let's see more the findings of our other special report on 1.5 degrees that have been that have enjoyed enormous media coverage, and since then it's the point of reference to facts and evidence, as Michael already said, related to climate change. And so let's look at a little bit the urgency. Because one of the great messages of this special report was, which actually none of us who participated in it really forethought, that yes, we can still do it. We have not yet committed the climate to 1.5 degree warming. We have, if we think about carbon budgets, there are new numbers in this report, and depending on the method you choose, this remaining carbon budget is different. We have already used 2,200 gigatons. But in this most relaxed carbon budget number from this report, we have, at the present emissions, we have less than 18 years left until we will have committed to planet to 1.5 degree climate change. If you look at the less relaxed number, so the other extreme number which is in the report, we have only 9 years left at this particular level of emissions. that poses a tremendous pressure and a tremendous urgency to solving this particular issue. And there is no doubt that in the decarbonization of our energy system, which is the fundamental challenge for resolving the climate conundrum, nuclear power can play and probably will play a very important role. But there are many questions remaining. So this is from the report. It shows that in most of the pathways that we looked at in this report, the role of nuclear power does increase, and I will show you some insights of this. However, the report also states the following, for which this report is also very important to give more insight. It says, the political, economic, social and technical feasibility of solar energy, wind energy and electricity storage technologies has improved dramatically over the past few years. Notice the word dramatically, not something the IPCC usually uses. While that of nuclear energy and carbon dioxide capture and storage in the electricity sector have not shown similar improvements. So that's the question. Without these improvements, is this compatible with this delivering under this tremendous urgency? So these are the pathways that can get us to 1.5 degrees, and here they are emissions from today down from present roughly 40-something gigatons down to, as you see, many negative emissions in the second half of this century. Let's zoom on 4 of these and let's see what this actually means for our energy sector. How will these futures actually look like? So these are these 4 illustrative scenarios decomposed, and the solid lines are the actual emission pathways. The gray part is the fossil fuel related emissions, and yellow is the bioenergy combined carbon capture and storage, whereas orange is afforestation. So as you see, these are kind of the 2 most extreme scenarios. Both of them, the first one, which doesn't rely so much on carbon capture and storage, but that requires a very urgent, almost a free fall in energy demand. This one, which assumes perhaps, which is more where we are heading today, but it still has some very important consequences for the energy sector. So let's look at what these 4 different scenarios mean for nuclear power. And I don't want to bore you through the whole table, but so these are the 4 scenarios, and within that, as you see, particularly the left 2 scenarios imply that you are talking about a 500% increase in nuclear capacity by the middle of this century. So the big question is, will the nuclear industry be able to deliver that? What are the conditions? And there is no other report and document which provides more of the pertinent facts and policy context to answer many of these questions related to climate change and how the nuclear industry can contribute to solving this extremely urgent problem. Without further ado, I think it's best if we hear Michael himself showing some of these facts that relate to this urgency. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Diana, for this foreword. Now I think we can move over there to see better.
Well, first of all, a big thank you to CEU for hosting this event. It's very generous, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I mean, it's an important location, I think, and we're very proud to be able to do this here. And let me just say a few words about the status report in general. This is obviously not a one-man show. This is a team of interdisciplinary experts, 8 main authors that work on this from 6 countries, including 4 university professors that have contributed to this, and including the co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Rocky Mountain Institute in the United States, Amory Lovins, who's one of the best known energy thinkers that are around. So we have a quite extraordinary team that has put together this rather thick report with 323 pages. So I encourage everybody anyway to have a look at it, because it's actually quite visual, as you're going to see from the slides I've extracted. Now, the first thing when we're talking about energy policy is that on energy you will not understand anything if you look at a picture, meaning like if you look at statistics of one given year. It's like looking at a photograph rather than looking at the movie. The energy industry is a very slow industry. It's a long-term investments, and it takes many years between you know, the initial thoughts for facilities and they're actually delivering electricity in this case. So here is the projections that existed in the middle of the 1970s by various players for installed nuclear capacity for the year 2000. And I'm just picking out two. One is by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the other one is by the OECD. The IEA's scenario was labeled the most likely in 1974, the most likely. This is not the high scenario. The high scenario is somewhere up there in the sky. The most likely scenario had forecasted 3,600 installed gigawatt. What does that mean? It's 1 gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. That's roughly the size of a nuclear power plant. So, in other words, they forecasted something like 3,500 nuclear reactors by the year 2000. The reality we have down here. So reality, which was around 350 gigawatts or 350 reactors roughly, is less than a tenth of what was originally thought of. This had huge consequences for planning, for investment, etc. So what we are actually looking at in particular is reality, right? So this is an empirical analysis to what actually happened in the past in order to get a better understanding of what the future will look like. So this is a multi-indicator assessment. So never look just at one indicator. It's not very meaningful. You have to put them all together in order to get a real picture of what the situation is. So that's the first one. It's reactor startups and closures in the world. The upper part is showing reactor connections to the grid, and the lower part is reactor disconnections. Like for us, a startup is grid connection, closure is grid disconnection. And as you see that we had these two waves, the first one in the 70s, second one in the 1980s, and then this flat development until today, with the exception of the upper part here, which is China's nuclear program, which entirely dominated the past 15 years. And we see on the other side the delayed impact of Chernobyl, the Chernobyl accident in 1986, and the break of the wall. Actually, it's like a combined effect that led to these reactor closures. And then we see the Fukushima effect that happened in March 2011 with a huge impact on reactor closures. If we look at the same graph for the European Union, it shows that it was basically over in terms of startups a long time ago, and those were the three last reactors that were connected to the grid. So the closures have dominated the picture for a long time. We look at the cumulated effect, so we see like this uninterrupted rise of the number of reactors operating. The red line is the installed capacity. Until the late 80s, it continued to rise, and then we have this plateau until the events of Fukushima with its sharp drop, and then an increase over the past 5 years, 6 years even, to 417 reactors now. So this is a typical example. If you just look at the last few years, one could say, oh well, this is an increasing industry. Like, I mean, it's going up the hill. Well, it's very true, except that the numbers are very small. Like the increase, the relative increase is very small. And the absolute figure of 417 reactors is still below the number we had reached already 30 years ago in 1989. And the absolute historic peak was in 2002 with a lot more reactors, 438 installed. The operating capacity has the curve has a little different shape, right, than the number of reactors. So it continued to increase, although the number of reactors was plateaued. The main reason is that if reactors were closed, they were smaller than the ones that started up. And the second reason is it happened through so-called uprating. So existing reactors were upgraded, the capacity was increased through technical means. So we have this effect where it's not entirely parallel. We have actually achieved a new maximum of installed capacity in 2018, or currently at mid-2019, just slightly over the previous record of 2006. Same picture again for the European Union, and we see that the overall long-term trend has been going downwards for the past 30 years, with a maximum of reactors operating achieved in 1989, and we see that it's almost 50 units less in operation as we speak. Next indicator, we look at electricity generation. And we have had a historic maximum in 2006, and we have had an increase over the past few years. We've seen the installed capacity went up, numbers of reactors went up. In total, but we also see that which role China plays in this. And although there was a 2.4% increase globally, much of that increase was due to China, and much to that increase was actually due to China over the past years, because as you see, the red stacks didn't really move, right? I mean, what moved is the Chinese program. The other indicator is the relative share of nuclear power in the overall electricity mix, which peaked in 1996 with about 17.5%, and it has been slowly declining to currently just over 10%. I must say that it is always important that you keep in mind that these figures are always on the commercial energy industry. It means, like, for example, we have a cabin in Canada that is off-grid, where we generate solar power and store it for the past 30 years. None of those kilowatt hours of that production are in these figures, because they're off-grid. They're not going through any kind of accountability. Now, of the past couple of decades, the number of facilities that are off-grid, so they're not accounted for in the official statistics, has been boosted all over the planet. So these figures are always partial when it comes to the actual share of non-commercial electricity generation. Next, who is generating nuclear power? There's 31 countries currently, which is about a 15% share of the countries represented at the UN. So it's a small share of countries of the planet. We also see that it's very much concentrated about a number of big players, and as it has been the case over the past few years, roughly 5 countries roughly generate 70% of the nuclear power in the world. That is by order: the United States, France, China, Russia, and South Korea. China has been moving up the ladder continuously now to the third position. We also see that, you know, the United States, in terms of total output, very largely dominates the picture, and the two first players together generate 47% of the world's nuclear electricity. So almost half is generated by only two countries. It's just to say that it's a very concentrated effect. It's not like a spread out phenomenon throughout the world. The other column on the right-hand side shows the relative share of nuclear in the commercial electricity, and you see that the dates that are in the back show the historic peak. And as you can see that, you know, some of the shares have been going down significantly, and the actual achievement of the historic peaks has been many years ago. If we try to get an idea of where is this going, the number of reactors that are listed as under construction is obviously a key indicator. And as you can see here, it peaked in the middle of the by the late 1970s. So in 1979, it peaked at 234 units. Another good example of why it's so important to look at the long-term developments. Because if you represented this graph from 2005 onwards, you would get a very different picture. And it wouldn't really reflect the fact that the 46 reactors that are under construction listed currently is a small share of what has been under construction in the late 1970s. And while there has been a significant increase between 2005 and 2013, we have now 22 reactors less under construction, as was the case 5 years ago. So even there we have another trend that has been reversed over the past few years, and obviously Fukushima is here one of the key events that drove this development. Now the other thing that is remarkable is that you see these parts in this brownish red or reddish brown, which is reflecting the share of projects that actually have not been completed. If there are 46 reactors today in the list as under construction, it does not mean automatically that they will generate power one day. A lot of these reactors have not been completed. So of the 48 out of these 234 have not been completed. And it's been a phenomenon throughout nuclear history. We have counted 94 reactors that have been abandoned at various stages of construction. And this is like on a timeline by country, and you see like the United States have been dominating the statistics in the 1980s with the largest number of abandoned projects. Russia was an important player in the 1990s, and there's a number of countries that have had intermediate numbers of units abandoned in the 1980s. And the phenomenon has been less remarkable, but it still exists. The latest ones to be abandoned was in 2017, the two reactors in the United States, two reactors in South Carolina, and the name of the site is VC Summer. And I mean, the idea, you have to keep in mind, this is actually spending a lot of money without any outcome, right? So the current estimate is more than $10 billion had been spent on this construction site, with the outcome zero. Like there were, I believe, 9 increases in tariffs for the consumers, the local consumers, with an outcome that is strictly zero. So they're paying basically for an abandoned construction site. I don't think that is the most effective way to spend ratepayers' money. Who is building? No surprise here. China is still leading with 10 units. India with 7, Russia with 5. A total of 46, we've said that. The other 2 points I want to make, one is that some of these reactors have been under construction for over a decade. Actually, 2 have been under construction for over 3 decades, which is, you know, pretty long to wait for a facility to generate income. And we see that the phenomenon of delayed constructions is something very present. So we can document at least 27, between 27 and 29 of 46 that are behind schedule, many of them for several years. Here we have tried to illustrate the evolution of construction times. So to get an idea of you know, how many reactors were connected to the grid, so that's the size of the balls, of the bubbles, and how the construction time developed over time. And we can see there was a very clearly identifiable trend until the late 1980s. The balls became bigger, so more reactors connected to the grid, and an increase in construction time. And after the 1990s, it's like complete anarchy. Like no rules to the game anymore. The balls jump all over construction time, so it's very difficult to actually make sense out of this picture, except that the balls, obviously, as we've seen before, are very small. So there's a small number only that of units that have come online. We assess this project by project, country by country, and you see that if we look at the past decade, 63 reactors were connected to the grid. A staggering 37 of these were connected to the grid in China, which is quite an industrial achievement. We see Russia has connected 8. We see that the average construction time is around 10 years, with a huge range from about 4 years to over 40 years. That's a record holder in the United States. What's Bar 2 is probably going to stay the record holder for some time. But we see, like for all of the countries, pretty large ranges. We have looked at the construction times, expected versus real construction times of the reactors that have been connected to the grid between the beginning of 2018 and the middle of 2019. And we see that roughly the pattern here is that construction times have doubled. So the construction times that were staying roughly within the expected time frame were all 3 in China. All the others, even if we leave alone this record holder here from Russia with 35 years since construction start, roughly the average is that the construction times have doubled compared to original expectation. Next indicator, obviously important, is construction starts. Always the same pattern. We have these developments in the 1970s and 80s, with a peak in 1976 of 44 construction starts. Just for those interested in the more technical side, a construction start is not cutting the trees or building a road. Construction start runs only from the moment on when the base mat, the foundation of the reactor building is poured. That's important because in reality the overall project time is much longer than the actual construction time. Just keep that in mind. And construction start means pouring the concrete. So we have this development where we had actually seen even in 1995 a year without any construction start. and a very flat blue part, so that's the world without, outside China, and China totally dominating. Construction starts with up to 10 or 15 in 2010. But it's remarkable the absence of China over the past few years, and it's not quite clear how this is will be playing out over the next few years, because the last time that a commercial reactor construction was begun was in December 2016, which is already quite some time ago. So we have seen on a global level 5 construction starts in 2018 and 1 so far in 2019. Always keep that in mind, compare that with what happened in the 1970s. So it basically, I just calculated, it basically took 7 years to do 1 reactor less construction start than in 1 year in 1976. No surprise here, if there's no construction, the average age increases every year. And this is the first year that the average age of the operational fleet is exceeding 30 years. I mean, 30 years on average, including 80 units that have operated for 41 years and more, and 192 for 31 years and more, between the two up to 40 years. So this represents basically another technological age, right? I mean, 40 years ago is, I don't know who remembers what the cars looked like 40 years ago. But they looked quite differently from what they look today, I can assure you, because I do remember. And a nuclear power plant that has been here for operating for 40 years means been starting to build for 50 years ago. So it was designed over 50 years ago. So we're literally talking about, another planet that, has generated these facilities to begin with. This is the age of the EU fleet. We see a similar pattern, except it's even older. So it's over 34 years now on average, with a very large share of units that have generated been connected to the grid for 31 and more years. Now, we always have in the report what we call focus countries. So we select a number of countries that we assess in depth. This in-depth assessment is individual and can look very differently from one country to the other. So the authors have a great freedom to process these countries. So they are not, the analysis is not necessarily comparable. So I give you a few blips, because every country has a major analysis. So this is on France. What we did here is what we wanted to understand what the actual unavailabilities of reactors are. It's been a constant argument to say, well, nuclear provides power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In France, there's 58 operating nuclear power plants. These 58 reactors totaled over 5,000 reactor days without any production, so 0 kilowatt hours. Over 5,000 reactor days. Or, in other words, an average 0 production of 87.6 days, which is, to make it simple, almost 3 months. So 3 months, no production per reactor per year. I would say this is quite far from 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also looked at, what was the actual overlap of these outages, and just to look at the peak here. So at the most there were 27 reactors of 58 that were at 0 power, at the same time. And it's important to stress that of course a lot of times production is reduced. So this does not take into account reduced production. It only takes into account the days or the time that is where production was at zero. We did the same for Belgium, and in 2 words, the outcome is actually even more amazing, with a total average outage time of 180 days per reactor. So that is, if my calculation is correct, is almost 6 months. So almost half of the year, on average, the reactors were at zero production in Belgium in 2018. Another blip on Germany, because there's all kinds of myths floating around on Germany, that decided in just after, 4 months after the events of the 11th March of 2011 in Fukushima, to phase out nuclear power. So we compare the system between 2010, the year pre-Fukushima, and 2018. So nuclear, with the progressive nuclear phase-out, production decreased by 64.5 billion kilowatt hours, that is terawatt hours, while the renewable energy output increased by 121. In other words, it was almost twice compensated by renewables. But what is important here is that at the same time, consumption decreased by 20 terawatt hours, which in my taste is very far from being enough, but that's another issue. The export, the net export of electricity increased by 33 terawatt hours, and the fossil fuel generated electricity decreased by 43.5 terawatt hours. So these are very significant indicators also in the climate change debate, of course. So that the nuclear phase-out is not necessarily combined with an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and the use of fossil fuels. Please.
Do you have a rough number for what the total consumption of Germany is in a year? So what that relates to in terms of?
Of total, I don't have the number offhand, but the order of magnitude is 500 terawatt hours, I would say. But that's not quotable, so that's the order of magnitude. The status report also has, like sort of traditionally every year, a chapter that looks at a comparative assessment in the nuclear sector versus developments in the renewable energy sector, and specifically focusing after, as you will see, on solar and wind, like new non-big hydro renewables. So what we see here is the global investment decisions on new renewables and versus nuclear power. There is no publicly available database for investments in nuclear power. So what we did is sort of a back-of-an-envelope calculation. We assume that when the decision is made to start construction of a nuclear power plant, there is sort of a rough estimate of what it would cost in the public domain. And we decided to take that as the investment decision. That's why we call it investment decision and not investment. We decided to take that as an order of magnitude of investment, and we apply it to the entire sum to the given year of construction start. So obviously it doesn't really reflect reality, because the money is stretched out, the spending is stretched out over the years. So in reality it's actually less. But the basic reading here is that this is very much dominated by China, of course, because they have started most of the construction sites over the past 15 years. And the basic analysis is that it's at least a factor of 10, so an order of magnitude below of what is spent on nuclear compared to renewable energies. The reason is very simple. We have had a dramatic decline in costs for renewable energy technologies. This is an assessment by Lazar Bank. I like estimates like that, assessments, because it's not partisan, right? I mean, they're not builders, they're not industry, they're not involved the same way as other stakeholders here. So their assessment of what is called the levelized cost of energy value. So you look at various projects and you make a sort of an average of those projects. Solar came down over the past decade, since 2009 to 2018, by 88%. So we're getting close to a factor of 10 of reduction in costs. This is very significant. Wind power costs declined by about 69%. Gas, by the way, came down too, by roughly 30%. Minor development, less than 10% in the coal sector, and the only sector where costs went up is the nuclear sector. So we're talking here generating costs of new facilities. So what happened over the past decade in terms of power generation in the world? And looking, if we take, if we index it in 2008, we look at what was actually added by, net added by every year by technology. And we realize that already non-hydro renewables have added most of the additional electricity generation. And hydro has, like, almost twice as much as hydro has added actually over the time frame, while the generation in nuclear is actually below the level of what was generated in 2008. So those are the orders of magnitude, and I invite you always to look at the shape of the graphs more than the figures, because the shapes actually tell you the story more than the figures. And here we have a few nice shapes of graphs. This is the capacity added in wind, solar, and nuclear since 2000. You see this dramatic increase in wind and solar, and the stagnation on the nuclear side. The same on the production, where if you compare if you put the baseline on 1997, which was the signature of the Kyoto Protocol, that's why we did that. We wanted to see, since the signature of the Kyoto Protocol, what have the various technologies actually added in terms of electricity. And we see the leader here is really wind by far, and solar has passed nuclear in added electricity. Here are the cumulative numbers. So this is not added anymore, not indexed. These are actually the absolute numbers. So we see that in installed capacity, solar has now gone beyond the installed capacity of nuclear. Of course, the same capacity doesn't generate necessarily the same amount of electricity, so nuclear is still generating more power than wind and solar combined, but it's getting, the trend is very clear. So one has to look at trends besides the absolute numbers. Now, just a few examples for the developments in certain countries. Here's wind. So here's China and the evolution 2000 to 2018. It's really staggering to what extent China has actually built up its renewable energy industry, and you see now that in spite of the fact that China is the only country, and it's the country that has been massively investing into nuclear power, wind turbines alone generate more power in China than nuclear power. And solar is catching up quickly. what happened in the EU. This is very interesting because basically, you know, there is hardly any investment anymore. This is startup and closure of generating capacity in the past year. So we have wind, we have solar, we have other renewables like biomass, for example, is the biggest chunk in there. And then we have a tiny little bit more of natural gas, no change in nuclear, and a decline in fossil fuels. This is the past year's reality. These are not projects. This is what has been connected to the grid. And the order of magnitude is 95% of what was connected was renewable. So it's actually happening, right? We are not talking some kind of wild vision or so, or some kind of fantasy. It's industrial reality. We look at the capacity numbers. In terms of installed, these are absolute numbers. So solar is almost caught up to nuclear in installed capacity terms in the EU. Actual production remains still below, but again, the trend is very clear. Nuclear production goes down, the other two go up. We have here the capacities added. This is more dramatically, actually, if you look at it from a perspective of the change that took place since 2000, with the increase in solar, decrease in nuclear, and the same on the production side. A country that is often forgotten, although it apparently has now the highest number of inhabitants on this planet, is India. And in India, there's sort of a short-term, absolutely incredible revolution that took place in the solar sector. I mean, look at this jump that took place in the installed capacity over the past couple of years. And of course, we've seen wind overtaking nuclear already a few years ago. A stagnation in the nuclear production, and you know, I wouldn't be surprised if this is the year where solar overtakes nuclear power in India in output, in production, in actual electricity generation. So this was a lot of focus on these comparative analysis of performance of various electricity generating technologies. So what does that mean for the whole climate change issue? We need to keep in mind that the generation of electricity is only about 20% of the final energy, but has a very much larger share, like 38% in 2016, of the overall CO2 emissions. So the power sector is important. It's not because it's only 20%. The share is increasing constantly, but it's also it's the largest chunk of CO2 emissions. So it's important. Now, what is the challenge here? And I'm very much insisting on the definition of the challenge, because everything is in the question. We are increasingly under time pressure. Diana Ilgeforsatz has presented this from an IPCC perspective. Its time is getting short. So when some colleagues in the energy sector come up with some wild ideas for the second half of the century of technologies, or I don't know what, fusion is my favorite there, I have a very simple answer. I'm not interested, because it's going to come too late anyway. So what I'm interested in is, you know, if you invest money, and it doesn't matter whether it's $1 or euro or foreign, how much reduction in greenhouse gas emissions can you buy for it? How fast? And it's the combination between cost and time that makes the measure of effectiveness. This is crucial to understand. one doesn't work without the other. Like if we have low carbon technology that are available maybe in the second half of the century, there's no point in talking about this now. We need to discuss first what we can do now, today, basically, and in the short term. And we cannot spend money twice. I mean, it's only there once. So the 10 billion plus that have been spent in the United States for pouring concrete and melting steel on a project that will never see the light is a huge blow to climate change, because that money has not been put into strategies that come up with short-term clear effects on the emission reductions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So I have given you the picture on nuclear power. Over the past decade, new nuclear power took about 10 years, and again, construction start to grid connection, about 10 years. That's much longer than many other options that are on the table. And this is combined, like the slowness is combined with very high costs. So it makes it basically the worst option. It's not even an option if you think about it, because we have neither the time nor the money to spend on that option. So what remains is the question of existing nuclear power plants, but because they're there. So you can argue this is very fast. You just have to keep them running, and they will generate power that is low carbon. Well, it's very simple. The argument doesn't change. The question is, how much does it cost? Even if you leave entirely on the side specific problems that nuclear power plants can have, and some people are concerned about: safety, nuclear proliferation, nuclear waste issue, etc. We don't talk about this here. We're just, if you just take the climate issue, the actual reasoning remains the same. And we have looked at that in some detail. Now, this might look as like a wild graph, but I'll try to explain. It's actually less wild than it seems. First, this is concentrating mainly on the US. There are some international blips in there, but it's basically based on US figures. What we have here in this range part of the graph, we have the evolution of the range of the wholesale power price in the United States market. So we have had, a pretty regular decline of the overall wholesale market price. Then we have here the US average nuclear operating costs. There's not that much movement. We have seen an increase until around 2012, and then a slight decrease of the past 5 years on average. Now, on the whole utility scale solar average power purchasing agreement cost level in the United States, you see this staggering decrease. This is a much bigger decrease than we've seen in the Lazar figures that I've shown earlier. And these are power purchasing agreements. We're talking, this is commercial. This is not a study. This is actually commercially traded electricity. And we see this huge decline, which if you look at the end of that level here, it's getting close to $20 per megawatt hour. That's the lower level of the wholesale price range. $20. We're not talking about minima. This is important. These are power utility scale PPAs on average, so it's various projects. So the absolute lowest numbers are below $20 per megawatt hour now. That's staggering. And now we're looking at wind, which has gone even below the level of solar in power purchasing agreements. And now come in these kind of strange things here. These are quartiles. So the nuclear power industry has been, like in many countries, refusing to publicly transmit information on the actual cost of individual reactors. That's what we actually need in order to make policy and industrial decisions. They're not publicly available. So what they do is they look at the quarter of the plants that are the most expensive ones to run, and then the quarter, they put it into quarters, and they average it out over 3 years, right? So the first is 2012 to 2014, the second one is 2014 to 2016. So it's really averaged out. It's just to say, this is flattened out, right? So the extremes are much larger than that. But it already shows that, you know, from that perspective, you know, even the most cost-effective quartile is not competitive anymore with new solar and new wind in the U.S. market. So these are real numbers. These are not studies. I really insist on that, because one has to be always very careful what is hypothesis and what is actually figures on the ground. So this is one of the biggest problems of the nuclear industry here. And what we see here also is, like, on one hand, these rectangular indicators below here is, these are December 2017 figures from Colorado, and they're median bids. So they're not, again, it's not extremes, they're median bids. And 2017 is, December 2017 is almost 2 years ago. And you can publish new figures basically every month, because the decline has been continuing all the time. But you see that these non-subsidized costs, they include storage. So solar with storage becomes competitive with the average cost of nuclear power in the grid. So new solar plus including storage is the same cost or cheaper than operation and maintenance costs for nuclear power, leaving investment aside. That's the basic message. And we're talking unsubsidized. And obviously, the lowest numbers you can find, you can go cherry picking around the world, and you find incredible numbers now as the lowest numbers for solar and wind electricity generation. I'm going to jump this to save some time. So I'll conclude with this. We have seen that there's a very low level of nuclear construction. So it's no surprise that, for the first time we have now a world nuclear fleet that is, has over 30 years of operational time. In 2018, if we do the analysis, the annual analysis, nuclear power added 9 gigawatts and renewables added 165. And that gives you this kind of relationship that we have in the field. Nuclear power generation increased by 2.6%. I think the number is actually 2.4. That should be an error. Most of that increase was through China. Wind increased by 29% and solar by 13%. We have seen the numbers on construction sites very low, far too low to actually maintain that industry in good shape. Average construction times have increased in many cases, and average now 10 years over the past decade. While nuclear costs increase, solar and wind continue to decrease all over the world. So the conclusion on climate change is quite clear. If we want to fight climate change, which increasingly has been termed the climate emergency, we need to invest into effective strategies that combine speed and competitive costs in order to achieve results of drastic emissions reductions. And I think it's clear now that nuclear power has turned out as not only the most expensive, but above all, the slowest option to generate so-called low carbon. And I didn't want to get into that debate about low carbon or no carbon or this carbon. It's irrelevant to this basic point. Electricity and to actually provide fundamental energy services to the citizens of this planet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now, let me call Benedek Jávor to thank you very much, obviously, to the floor, and we will conclude with Benedek, and then so we will conclude with Benedek, and then there will be a question and answer session. It's on already. Benedek, please. Yes.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the organizers to give me a couple of minutes to cover another issue which was not very much addressed by the excellent speech by Michael or by the contribution of Diana. But I think that it's obviously an important question for the public to speak about, and that's the transparency and access to information regarding nuclear projects globally, because if there is any overall characteristic of nuclear power generation and nuclear industry, besides of being too slow, too expensive, and so on and so forth, then normally in most of the countries the nuclear industry is completely untransparent, and it's impossible to receive and to get reliable data on what is happening in the nuclear industry, and even we have difficulties to have access to the fundamental, very basic information regarding the contracts the public, the governments are making with nuclear industry, if there is a difference between the government and nuclear industry. So the public discussion, the public discourse over the nuclear issue is a very distorted one because the public knows very few about any relevant information regarding the nuclear projects. And here I believe that the Paks 2 case in Hungary is really a pilot case because untransparency of the project is quite obvious. But here in Hungary we had some successes, some developments to prove that it's not impossible to challenge the untransparency of the nuclear industry. Very quickly, timeline of the nuclear project in Hungary, Paks 2, and the related court case, which, or not only the court case, before in the court case already we had some other initiatives to just to remind you that how this whole thing happened in Hungary. So the original intergovernmental agreement was signed in Moscow in 2014, January 2014, and the end of the year the EPC and O&M contracts and a few contracts were signed in Moscow, and right after signing them they were classified by the Hungarian government. Right after they were signed, I submitted a complaint to the Data Protection Authority in Hungary to ask them to review the classification of the contract, saying that there is no any legal and legitimate reason to classify the totality of the contracts. There might be, I'm sure that there are some information which should be classified because of security reasons, but it's impossible to classify the complete set of the contracts. Also, there were some critics by the European Commission, so there was a need for a new fuel contract in 2015. In July 2015, I sent an access to data request regarding the contract to the Prime Minister office. It was denied, saying that it's a classified data. Then years passed, and in April 2017, finally the Data Protection Authority, after 2.5 years, so they were really not hurrying up to control or to look into the details of the contracts. But after 2.5 years, they published a conclusion which was not an official decision, but a kind of conclusion that probably the classification cannot be applied to the entire text of the contract. It was not an official decision, but still, based on this conclusion of the Data Protection Authority, the government decided to declassify the contracts, and it happened in May 2017. Then after the declassification, if you think that it was a clear case now and you can have access to a declassified data, it's not the case. I sent again an access to information, and this time it was denied on the basis of business interest, that the entire contract package is business interest, and it cannot be published or sent to me as a member of the European Parliament. And against this decision of the government, I went to court, and I challenged this conclusion or this decision of the government, saying that it's unacceptable to deny the publication of the contracts based on business interests. Soon it has had become obvious that it's not only against the Hungarian government. Rosatom joined the court case on the side of the Hungarian government. And finally, in May 2018, at the first instance court, there was a conclusion that, which was saying that around 70% of the contracts should be published with blackouts of certain paragraphs and information which could be of business interest or because of security considerations. The government and the Rosatom appealed against the first instance court's decision, but early 2019, early this year, the appeal court decided and they even concluded in a much more stronger transparency regime to be applied, saying that almost 90% of the contracts should be published. Regarding some paragraphs, the case was sent back to the first instance court, and it's a still ongoing case. So on the first instance court we won this repeated case again, but there was an appeal by the government and Rosatom, so now we are waiting for the decision of the second instance or the appeal court. But what is important that in March 2019 the PAX2 project company published the contracts, and that's the first time in the history of nuclear industry when EPC and O&M contracts were published by a nuclear company. And that's very important, and I think that the general conclusion of this whole procedure is that, of course, this is an uphill battle. It's not easy to ensure and to get the transparency and access to information regarding the nuclear industry, but it's not hopeless. And with endurance, even in Hungary, which might be not the best example for rule of law and transparency issues, even in Hungary it is possible to force the government and nuclear industry and Rosatom for a better transparency. So I think that this could be a pilot case for other activists, other NGOs and citizens to make the fight, because it's possible, based on European law, to force the nuclear industry and governments to publish the fundamental information and contracts regarding nuclear projects. And the last conclusion is that when they published the contracts, it had become obvious that the reality of the contracts is very different from the communication of the government. So it's not for its own sake, not just publishing the contracts and then we are happy that there is transparency, but it's really important because there are major differences between the governmental communication and the reality of the contracts. They are talking about turnkey contract, but according to the contract there are several exemptions from this turnkey regulation. Even the legality of the contracts are questionable at the time of signing the contracts. There are very strange guarantee rules in the contracts. It's an unbalanced contract, strong guarantees for the Russian side and very weak ones for the Hungarian one. Surprisingly, for example, decommissioning of Paks 1, a nuclear power plant, is included in the contract, which was about absolutely something else, about the construction of Paks 2, and so on and so forth. And just to finish, there was another issue to be addressed, where I was asked to address, and just really to pop it up. Michael was talking a lot about the costs of nuclear energy compared to renewables and energy efficiency measures. Together with financial backing of the Green Group in the European Parliament, I ordered from Energiaklub and Wuppertal Institute a study on a possible alternative energy strategy for Hungary, and the conclusion of the study that the average cost of energy generation in Hungary with different scenarios shows that the green scenario without nuclear option in Hungary by 2050 is far the cheapest option for Hungary. So it's not only the geopolitical considerations, it's not only because of security or environmental measures, simply based on pure economics. The green scenario without nuclear power generation is the best for Hungary, it's the cheapest for Hungary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernadette, and thank you for all of the speakers for their excellent presentations. And now I would like to ask you to come to the front because now we will proceed with a question and answer session. And if you allow me, I would like to give the priority for the journalist, since this is a public press event, to raise their questions and issues to the speakers. Pavel.
Hello, my name is Pavel Salaj. I'm a journalist at Director in Slovakia. I have two questions. First is, Mr. Schneider, what do you think about premature switching off of power plants, like we have seen it in Germany? And the related sub-question, what happened in Germany with the emissions? And how this power was replaced or has been replaced? Another question is, when you counted the levelized cost of electricity, how did you factor in the cost of spent fuel management, which is a big question mark? So, yeah, these two questions.
Thank you. Well, on the German question, have you been here when I showed the graph? It's pretty clear. So the reduction. Sorry.
Shall I find the slide?
Oh, I can, you wanna have it back on? Yeah, that's a good idea, actually.
Because we can't remember all your slides.
There were some.
Yeah, there was some, a
Couple.
lot of information.
There were a few slides, it's
And
true.
and some information.
Oh, okay, I understand. Sorry for that.
We might, probably should just,
Can we have it? Well,
well, I will try.
it doesn't matter, I'll, maybe it'll come, maybe it'll come.
For it and you ask for the question
Hmm?
in the meantime.
No, I have it. I have it here. It's just,
Oh, you used
it's
to-
just that they
Screen.
need to get it on the screen. Anyway, they just have to go. No, they just have to
It's-
switch the.
Switch here.
No,
Oh, yours is over here.
here, it's there.
No, it's
Because
yeah.
it's not on the same computer.
No, it's
Yeah.
not on here.
So it
And
needs to
anyway,
be switched between
Let's
computers.
start here, then probably it will come in.
It'll come. Anyway, just to remind you the numbers. The reduction in nuclear output was 64.5 terawatt hours compared. We are comparing 2018 with 2010. 2011 was the nuclear phase out decision. The fossil fuel reduction was 43.5 terawatt hours. And the CO2 emissions have been going down over the past few years. I don't have the graph right here, but the trend is downwards in spite of that, due to the fossil fuel reduction. But at the same time, they have increased net exports. So you could actually add some of the exports that are based on fossil fuel generation. So you could actually reduce fossil fuel electricity generation by more than the numbers I gave you, because there's so much now of electricity that has been exported because it's so cheap, and the German electricity is so cheap, and it's pushed into commercially into other countries. And the other important part is the decrease of consumption, which obviously plays into emissions reductions. It's a similar, by the way, maybe this is even more surprising in the Japanese case, because you know that Japan basically has abandoned nuclear power, and for some, you know, it went from over 50 reactors, 54 officially in 2010, to 0 in 2014. And by 2015, the country had substituted 56% of the nuclear output of 2010, which is absolutely stunning, in 5 years. How did they do that? Well, 3/4 was by efficiency, and 25% by renewables. And the renewable share in Japan remains ridiculous still. So the margin, the possibility in Japan is much higher compared to Germany, because obviously the number for renewables increase, just the difference between 2010 and 2018 is 121 terawatt hours. So I remind you the figure on nuclear is 64.5, 121, so we're getting close to twice as much production on the renewable side compared to what they lost on the nuclear end. Your second question?
Spent fuel management cost.
Well, first of all, the LCOE numbers I have presented are not my numbers. These are the numbers from Lazare that they update every year. I think since around 2006 or something like that. Like it's the 12th edition. that was published in 2018. The basic idea is to integrate, I mean, to have an overall cost assessment. But the Lazar reports are always very thin, so the information on their hypotheses are not very exhaustive. But I would invite you to go back to their study of this issue.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, we would gather some questions
No,
now.
I prefer one by one.
One by
Yeah.
one? Okay.
My name is Peter Dunay. I'm a freelance, and I have a question to Dr. Schneider about
Mr.
whether the EU has any calculation based on real costs, as we heard from you in the case of the United States, including storage costs, which I think is basic for judging the solar and wind energy. Could you just elaborate in a few words about the methods of storage, energy storage in the EU and comparably to the United States? Thank you.
Well, actually, I think that what are the most valuable figures we have currently are the numbers that come out of auctions, because these are real commercial figures, right? These are not. It's not a study on potential costs. These are actually numbers that come out that are based on offers, on commercial offers. So the actual industrial players are bound by these prices. So we're talking actually prices rather than costs. Whether they make money with it after is their problem, right? It's not the problem anymore of the one that actually buys it. But in terms of off-head, the level of what comes out of auctions in the United States for solar, utility scale plus storage is in the order now of between $30 and $35 per megawatt hour. What comes out of, once again, what comes out of auctions, this is not a study, so, which is interesting because we're getting into the same price range as the average cost of O&M of nuclear in the market. I don't have the figure off head for I actually don't know whether there was an auction in Europe, in the EU, that would actually have the same kind of baseline, like solar plus storage, comparable to the US scenario. So I can't answer offhand this.
Thank you.
Question.
My name is Martin, I am from Reuters. I have one question. I'm not sure to which one of you, because I guess all three of you. What I'm interested in is clearly a breakthrough in terms of investment into renewable energy. There's also a breakthrough in other fields relevant to energy, like electric vehicles. My question is, in a place like the EU or in Brussels, what sort of policy urgency do you see to connect those two?
It's actually for the translators because.
Oh, okay. So what sort of policy urgency do you see between existing revolutions in the field of energy, vis-a-vis renewable investment, and say transportation, where there's a upcoming breakthrough in electric transportation? For just the purposes of this example, my theory is that using electric cars as sort of power banks sort of would be a very viable policy path if it existed on a large scale, say in a place like the European Union. So for policymakers, do you see the sort of commitment to make more or to sort of make more of a progress in time for climate change to be reversed? And if not, what do you think could be done to speed that up? I'm not sure that was clear, but
Yeah, it's clear.
I just would like to encourage everybody, if you have questions in Hungarian, please, you can come in because there will be translation for the gentleman.
We just learn quickly.
Artificial intelligence.
Well,
Shall I-
any of you.
I'm happy to say a few words if you want to complete. I think that this is a very important question. It's very clear. And you can see I mean, I find the German example very striking because what we have seen is basically a development, the investment development that you have been describing has been pushed originally by very generous feed-in tariffs, right? So a guaranteed retribution for selling, you know, anybody that would generate, let's say, solar power, sell it to the grid and get like much more. Just to give you an idea of the orders of magnitude, let's say get the double of the price that is in the grid to encourage people to invest into solar energy. That has been over time. You know, many times the feed-in tariff had been repaired, like adjusted to market reality, to technological reality, to costs, etc., etc. So now the situation, the real situation, is that it costs what is paid for by the feed-in tariff is maybe, let's say, 8 cents per kilowatt hour, but the cost, if they buy the same residential or whatever customer buys electricity, it's 3 times as expensive. So it went from twice the price to 1/3. So what does that mean? It means that basically now the encouragement, like the incitement that is existing, is for, if you have a power plant on the roof, you don't want to sell the electricity to the grid, because if you have to buy it, it's 3 times as expensive than when you generate your own. So it encouraged people to use their own electricity. So what do? They wash their clothes or their dishes when the sun is shining. Now that is basically load management. It's called load management. But the system failure of the German industry, of government regulations, of repairing the grid system, didn't do that service to the consumer. So they basically have to do it themselves. But it could be, and you've been mentioning electric vehicles, this will all not happen if this is not repaired from a regulatory and from a system point of view. Because an integration of millions of electric vehicles will only work if it's well thought through and there's a real grid managed load management, grid organized load management. Otherwise I can't see this happening. So we need a lot of work in this area, and I think that has been clearly a regulatory and political failure not to advance on all fronts, not only the technological side, but also on the system organization, on business models, on on many areas that are needed in order to drive this what is literally a revolutionary, a rupture scenario. I mean, we're not in an evolutionary scenario, we're in a rupture scenario. And that's obviously difficult for societies to adapt.
If I may react just on 2 points. The first on the policy urgency in the EU and how the EU is reacting on this policy urgency. First of all, the whole energy system is a very complicated question in the EU, as it's not purely a market-related or technology-related problem, but we have a serious institutional problem that where energy policy making belongs to. And parts of energy policy are member state competencies, parts of energy policy making is an EU competency. And there is a very delicate game between the EU institutions and the member states that who has the right to regulate what in the energy markets. And that creates a major problem, because a number of questions which should be regulated in a comprehensive way, they are really divided into 2 parts, and parts of it are regulated locally, like what is the energy mix of a member state is a complete member state competencies, while others are regulated on the EU level. So it's a very complex question. But the urgency for the need of a complete energy revolution and transition in the EU is clearly accepted by the European Commission. And already the clean energy package, parts of it were adopted end of last year, parts of it were adopted beginning of this year, regards the problem in a comprehensive way. So it's not only about renewable energy or energy efficiency, but it's about the electricity market design, it's about the energy governance file, it's about the energy performance of buildings, regulation, and so on and so forth. So the EU has a very comprehensive and complex approach to this. And also already, less than 1 year after the adoption of the clean energy package, in the mission letter to the Commissioner-designate for Energy, Kadri Simpson, Ursula von der Leyen already called the Commissioner-designate to review the 2030 targets, energy and climate targets, which were adopted less than 1 year ago, saying that it's clearly not enough to meet the Paris Agreement requirement. So the EU is in a kind of revolution. It's never ever seen before that less than 1 year the EU starts to review its own 2030, more than 10 years ahead, climate and energy targets, and also the approach which is mirrored by the system how the new Commission is constructed, that Frans Timmermans, first Vice President Frans Timmermans, is controlling in an overarching way sustainable transition of the EU is a clear indication how the EU or how comprehensively the EU is approaching the question, including transport. And transport belongs to Frans Timmermans, and Frans Timmermans from a sustainability perspective will check the EU transport policy making. And regarding the electric cars issue, I think that it's very important, and already Michael was touching the issue, that it's very important to recognize that when it comes to grid regulation, it's not only storage. And normally we are talking about electricity storage and what are the obstacles of energy or electricity storage. But it's not about storage, it's about energy management. It's about grid regulation, it's about grid management. And there are a number of additional measures besides of electricity storage, including smart grids, smart metering, including the using of electric vehicles in the energy management. And I believe that the big business, and if we come to a business perspective now, the big business, the big energy business of the future is energy management. just have a look what is happening at E.ON in Germany, what is happening at RWE in Germany. They split the companies to a dying out dinosaur with nuclear and fossil fuels, and the future energy companies, which are about energy efficiency, renewables, and energy management. The big business of the future of energy management, which includes a number of measures, including electric cars, including smart metering, smart grids, demand-side management, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
And it's going to happen in
I'm-
France.
I'm
They
afraid
do
we
the
need
same
to leave
They
this
wanna
room
Yeah.
in like a good 10 minutes, so
That's a lot of pressure, you know.
no pressure.
It's okay.
So, my name is Claudia. I'm a journalist from Emerging Europe, UK. Got a couple of questions, let's say, I'm gonna stick to first names, Michael and Benedict. We're talking a lot about cons of nuclear energy, and what can be a pro, if we can say, if there is one? Because before this presentation, I thought that at least one positive aspect was that it's 24/7. Now you're saying that with the France example, it's not even that. So why is the World Nuclear Association saying that nuclear energy can be a bridge to renewables in the long term instead of fossil fuel, gas, and coal, for example? And like for example, for the energy independence, I mean, nuclear can make Europe energy independent better than coal or natural gas that we export from Russia and Azerbaijan, for example. And for Benedict, you said that in Hungary, the nuclear option is the cheapest option that we have for a greener scenario.
No, not just the opposite.
You said the opposite?
Yeah.
Okay, because I didn't get this and I wanted to, if you could have more detail on this.
Anyone else understanding my presentation as saying that nuclear is the cheapest option? Because then I told something
Then you messed up.
completely wrong.
Okay, so, okay, can you then clear up
Yeah,
for
yeah,
me this aspect? Thank you.
Well, first of all, you know, I don't think in terms of pros and cons, because I think it's very sterile. You know, the work we do is the objective is really to provide a carpet for debate, right? It's to say, you know, the outcome, there's people that might say, oh, that's great, and there's people that say, oh, that's bad. That's their problem, it's not mine. But I think we need to first agree on the analysis. We have to agree on first on what the numbers are and you know, what the baseline is. So I call it a carpet for debate. That's the first thing. The second thing, when it comes to energy, you've used the term energy independence. It's a very complicated, difficult term because we're trading all kinds of things, and it's very interesting that you know, on one hand, there are often these very liberal views, and you know, globalization, and it's, you know, and then all of a sudden comes energy independence as a term that is kind of thrown in, saying this is like very different. To me, if I'm living in a country in France which has, you prefer I use that?
Yeah,
Okay. Sorry.
he comes with a purpose.
Hmm?
He comes with a purpose.
He comes with a purpose. I come from a country that has over 70% of electricity generated by nuclear power, but I don't know whether you know, but the share of final energy of nuclear is roughly 17%. 17%. So the vast majority of final energy is generated in France by oil as everywhere else, if you look at the energy sector. And so it's kind of strange that people talk about nuclear power, which is a, you know, minor fraction You know, they have this kind of argumentation and they say, oh, well, this is great, this makes us independent. Whereas the relative share is very, very small. And in the case of the very highest, you know, the world's highest share in electricity. By the way, Germany is now, with renewable energy, almost at the same level as the French with nuclear power. So it's roughly, both are roughly now around 17%. I think that, and sorry, there's a second point. It's always assumed that where the electricity is generated by nuclear power, it becomes domestic, right? That's kind of strange too, because the uranium is not in the country. France doesn't produce a gram of natural uranium anymore. And as we have seen in situations like Niger, for example, it can lead to actually very critical and problematic situations in the countries that provide natural uranium. Even if the diversity, there is a certain diversity in the uranium market. So nobody only depends on Niger to provide uranium. But you can make that same argument for coal or gas. There's not only South Africa or the US, there's a great diversity. Does coal-fired power become therefore national? Nobody would argue that. So it's kind of a strange argumentation that is being used for nuclear power. I don't consider it domestic because it's generated there. It depends on where the uranium comes from, where it's enriched. So it's a whole series. And finally, if it's that perspective, I mean, the most independent you can get is the local access to energy services that don't depend on any kind of foreign input. So the first thing to do is to use passive means to provide, you know, the famous passive house idea is to say, you know, you actually provide the energy services on a local basis. That makes you the most independent you can possibly think of. Does that help?
Can I jump in here because perhaps before we get into the cost, because I think I absolutely agree with Michael that we cannot reduce this question to pro and con. That's an oversimplification. But I think the key rationale why we do have to seriously consider nuclear power is the climate rationale. Because if you remember my scenarios that were in the 1.5 degrees, now especially because they were prepared, let's say 2016, 2017, since then, unfortunately the trends don't show that we are close to getting onto the free fall in demand scenario, but much rather on the extreme scenario of still emissions and energy demand going up and up. Which means that if we're slower in actually breaking the curve, that means that what was already suggested here, we will need enormous electrification of non-electric uses. That's what Michael suggests, that presently very small share of our final energy uses electricity. So, but that's the only thing we can decarbonize really well. We cannot decarbonize very well mobility except for electricity, heating. We can very well decarbonize through passive houses, as you just said, but if we don't go that way, but that doesn't show because that's also already demand reduction, if we don't go that way, we will also have to electrify also heating, which is in Hungary one of the biggest, actually the biggest energy use, and in much of Central Europe. So that means that's enormous pressure on the power industry to increase capacity, and that means that we are likely going to need everything, because we just cannot, if we are not curtailing the demand side effectively, then it means we are going to need tremendous increase in capacity expansion in the next 2 decades, and that would require also probably relying on every option that we have on decarbonized electricity. But that's why all these questions are here. Which of the options, which of the decarbonized electricity options can deliver on the time scale and with all these different So that's why I really like this report and Mike's presentation, that it highlights that these questions are extremely complex and there are many aspects and sub-aspects of this, and it's not only just the total amount of energy or total amount of carbon, but extremely complex thing that we have to answer. So I think the short answer is yes, the strongest pro is the climate rationale, and in general, not only climate but environmental. So part of the reason why China is going that way, because they just cannot, they had to reduce their urban air pollution and general air pollution, and that nuclear has been helping that process as well. So, but then there are all these other questions like costs that Benedict is going to get more into. Sorry, I think there is one other dinosaur in the room which I haven't heard Michael touch very much on, and that's the decommissioning. I mean, we cannot show from the historic cost, because there isn't a lot of experience on full, there is no experience on full decommissioning, and presently, at least in the committees I'm working on in the European Commission, there is a panic on how extremely much this is going to cost, and this is not in most of these figures. So that's another huge complexity which is going to come into this whole picture.
There is a chapter on decommissioning in the report, but which I have not touched upon to save time.
Just three short remarks. The first on the pros and cons for nuclear. Let's be frank. Nuclear industry is not simply an energy generation sector. Even the civil use of nuclear energy is closely connected to military activities and purposes. This, in some cases, for some people, might be a pro for nuclear energy. A country which maintains nuclear military capacity, if they don't want to spend enormous amount of money to maintain the nuclear knowledge, the nuclear technology in the country simply by military spendings, then they need the nuclear industry. Of course, you can challenge if we need nuclear weapons or not, but still there are countries with nuclear weapons. For them, nuclear industry is backing the military, including Russia. And that's the other side of the coin, because when we talk about the UK or France, of course the nuclear fleet helps them to maintain the military nuclear capacity. But in countries where we do not have nuclear weapons, like in Hungary, we are buying this technology from somewhere else, and with this buying the technology, we support even the military nuclear industry in that country, and in the case of Hungary, that's Russia. So it's not simply an energy generation decision when we go or we are not go for a nuclear investment, but also it's a decision that which country's military nuclear capacity is going to be supported from the public money of that country, and in the case of Hungary, that's the Russian military capacity. Regarding energy independence, of course, nuclear energy is a bit more independent from the external sources than oil or gas. But again, in France, for example, where they have a local nuclear industry, it can be argued that it's for energy independence or autonomy. But in a country where you buy the technology and you are dependent on the technology coming from somewhere else, you depend on them, on spare parts for the entire operation of the nuclear power plant. The repairs, all the services, and in the case of Hungary, even economically, you are becoming dependent on Russia. Talking about energy independence related to nuclear investments, I think is simply ridiculous. And the third is the cost for Hungary, and I think that this figure is quite clear, and if you are interested, you can download the entire study from fenntarthatóenergia.hu. I will give you the place where you can find it. But the conclusion is quite clear, that finally, if you compare the nuclear option, different intermediate options which differ from each other on the level of energy efficiency measures and so on and so forth, and the full green option, the average yearly cost of energy generation, it's not investment, it's not things like that, it's the cost of energy or electricity production on an average level yearly, then the cheapest option for Hungary is clearly the green option, the completely nuclear-free, intensive, renewable-based and intensive energy efficiency measured-backed option. So even from this perspective, there is no any pro for the nuclear option because it's too expensive.
Is there any more question from the side of journalists? Urgent questions? Because if not, then I would like to close this session and invite all of you to have a light lunch together with us, which provides you the opportunity to further networking and raising questions, especially for journalists who already have sat and arranged interviews with the speakers here. So thank you very much for your active participation and your time donated to this very important topic, especially very close to my heart. Now, and thank you very much for your excellent presentation and contribution. I think the picture was full with all these, and now it provides you with a good understanding of the relation of climate, nuclear energy, and all, and the meaning of life. Thank you.
Thank you to the chair lady, and thank you for the translator.
Yes, indeed.
Download the report. Leave it up.
Mihályával kéne kezdeni, jó? És addig a Michael valaki másnak a
Szerintem a folyosón is látják megkérdezem az operatőrt, hogy
Ne haragudj, Péter, de nem voltál itt egész végig, és nem gondoltam, hogy így...
Azért kérdem, én
Tehát, hogy ha a rádió, akkor... Persze.
Ha jó,
A Diánában.
ez egy dokumentum sorozat, tehát dramaturgiai okokból összevotott dolgokat, de szerintem semmi nem veszem el a és nem dolgok, nem nagyon
jó, köszönöm szépen. Ez lett már a másik ilyen a Fukushima. Mind a mai napig folyik bele a csendes óceánból.
Hát főképpen ugye ott több millió vannak, és most éppen arra jutottak, hogy nem tudnak vele mit csinálni, úgyhogy ott eddig tárolt februárokban, és hogy most éppen néhány hete csinálni, úgyhogy most biztos fogják minden a végén.
Nagyon jó a halász.
Daniela, akkor lehet, hogy while Diana is giving it up to me, and then after that.
No, I have not. Everybody tells me I should see it. No, everybody tells me, and I know that I have to see it at some point, but I just, you know, I mean, I'm just so unaware that this project is just insane. It's so good. It just absorbs my attention capacity, you know. Let me just grab my
No, because I was one of the first European journalists who managed to visit Chernobyl.
Oh, I see.
In '86, I was based in Moscow. And I noticed the Russians were different numbers and different methods, which are not
No, I have not seen, but I they say it's
Sorry, this part is postpartum. How come it's all politics and then
yeah, so it's fine, it's everybody's person. No, we need five, we'll need five, because we have someone's opening. I usually just randomly press buttons. This is the, so I usually it's because this one is kind of so this is my problem. Actually, you know what? Yeah. And I'll be
I was submitting questions for referendum several times and they were always rejected because they are really afraid of having a referendum. They know that they don't have the backing of the society. There is no option for the society to make a change. Well, you have my email address now.
oh right, yes, right. Is our ready?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have a card, but with outdated contact info. It happens.
But it's hard, so I only find a lot of